Natasha Lennard is a contributing writer for The Intercept, and her work has appeared regularly in the New York Times, Esquire, Vice, Salon, and The New Inquiry, among others. She teaches in the Creative Publishing and Critical Journalism program at the New School for Social Research, and is the author of 2 books, Violence, co-edited with Brad Evans, and Being Numerous, Essays on Non-Fascist Life, from Verso Books. In this interview, I asked Natasha about the recent murder by police of Tyre Nichols, Keenan Anderson, and the environmental activist known as Tortuguita. She talks about the fact that these are just 3 of the more prominent deaths this year alone at the hands of police, and explains the relationship of these losses to the inherent violence of policing. What she makes clear is that despite the fact that cops don't stop or prevent crime and actually produce more violence than they stop, it is still the case that for a number of reasons the burden is never on those who align with carceral thinking to defend the police. And why is that the case? Because there is a deep ideological attachment to police and policing, to so-called justice in a carceral world. And that attachment is fed by a regime of representation that reinforces the heroism of cops, in spite of all evidence to the contrary. As a means of working through this problem, Natasha talks about Antonio Gramsci's notion of common sense as a tool for understanding some of the baseline assumptions that exist to regulate action and reaction. These are some complicated issues, and she admits that it's tricky. While we can fall into the trap of using what feels like exhausted ideas, the trap of political theater in a sense, Lennard's analysis has a way of cutting through the contradictions and centering the fact of ongoing oppression. If you do that, then you move out of theoretical debates about strategy and into the streets. For this reason, she celebrates the small but nimble and durable protests against Cop City in Atlanta. She speaks ardently in support of the need for trans-liberation and articulates that imperative against the array of powerful revanchist far-right forces who stand against it. Because of the sort of spectacle of political polarization that we saw during Biden's State of the Union address, I kind of wanted to start there.
Sure.
The fact that, Tyre Nichols' parents were present at the State of the Union address, and this curious moment where you have Biden expressing sympathy. I always find, the celebritizing of heroes and victims to be kind of strange during the State of the Union address, like making these people that have suffered so much so recently participate in this spectacle is odd to me. And then to, in a sense, use them to, on the one hand, talk about white privilege, the particular privilege of not having to have the talk, but then also to sort of use them as a means of parading out this kind of apologistic discourse around police violence, which rested from Biden's perspective on this kind of bizarre notion of there being a covenant. He uses the term covenant between the public and the police that he suggested was sort of broken when they inflicted lethal violence on Tyre. So I guess, I wanted to kind of just open it up to your general reactions to that address, but this particular moment.
Right. I have a couple of responses to that. But I should preface them by saying, because I'm not super interested in civic religion, I didn't watch the State of the Union. I watched a gritty British crime TV show whilst that was happening. But that, given that I'm also committed to terrible online habits, I know precisely what happened, probably blow by blow, as if I had tuned in live thanks to Twitter, and very much do know the moment you're talking about, and which very much speaks to the problem of these sort of civic religious performances and the pomp and ceremony that they entail, and of course the presence of Tyre Nichols' family there is not the first time we've seen something like this, and obviously it's difficult to see people in such extraordinary pain that's produced by entrenched state practices being then asked to be sort of performers for the state. That said, I'm nervous sometimes to weigh in critically about the entire situation and presence of victims, families, in these moments, because of course these parents have agency. And it's not only Tyre Nichols' family who have chosen to take up state invitations and make their presence known. And there's a, you know, I don't think I would reject a narrative wherein they're just sort of dupes for democratic politicking and apologism. That might indeed be the effect of these kind of events and presences and invitations. But at the same time, these are families in, the worst imaginable grief, demanding acknowledgement. No thanks to Biden, and no thanks to, say, Kamala Harris speaking at the funeral for, fully acknowledging and reckoning with the violence. But I wouldn't want to deny the agency of these families demanding acknowledgement and finding whatever halls of access and power they can to attempt to do so in an impossible situation. Do I think it will lead to the change that would foreclose the possibility of future victims and future police murders? Absolutely not. I'm an abolitionist for a reason, but nor do I demand grieving families share my politics. But no, of course, I think there's something profoundly cynical on behalf of the politicians when their acts of acknowledgement and performance of shared grief must always then come with a reinstatement of the importance and indeed like societal necessity of the police. I mean, that's not an accidental speech act. And the figure that often arises in these moments, and did again in Tyre Nichols's funeral, was of course Al Sharpton, who spoke at the funeral and has often put himself at front and center of performances of grief with families who have lost their kids to the violence that is policing. Do I think he also does work incredibly hard to try and get families acknowledgement of sorts that they deserve? Yes. Do I see a cynicism and performance in it? Yes. But I wanted to draw attention to what he actually said at the funeral, which was he very much made a point about it being somehow especially awful that Nichols's executioners were, at least 5 of them, the 5 that have been charged, Black police officers. And in a sort of inverted logic of sorts, he was making the point of, how dare you as police officers act this way, given that the work of civil rights leaders and the work of struggle meant that you could be a police officer in the first place. And in a certain way, that's just a historical truth, right? Like without certain civil rights struggles, there would have not been places on, municipal police departments as they are now for Black police officers. But the idea of him framing that in the moment of this great achievement of what civil rights struggle has been about was, I think, really pernicious. And of course, not what Black liberation has meant to so many people for centuries of struggle. And indeed also forgets a long history of, the fact that it's Black individuals having worked as slave catchers. And James Baldwin's famous paragraphs in his long essay about the disappearance and murder of Black children in Atlanta. And it's a kind of meandering but brilliant long essay. And he writes about Black communities having all the more fear for Black cops, not because it's a specific type of betrayal, but because of a type of Black knowledge developed in response to what the philosopher Charles Mills calls white ignorance, in that what's so fearsome about Black cops is the idea that, they have an understanding that white cops don't, but because they are still very much in the system of white violence, the system of white supremacy that is policing. And I think people might have been reading Sharpton at the funeral saying something different, but really he was just repeating a particularly pernicious form of the bad apples argument that we see every single time. So yeah, I think there was a lot of troubling performances in response to this from public political figures. But I don't think that speaks at all against, the families doing everything they can, and using every kind of route possible to demand an acknowledgement that Tyre Nichols himself was obviously not accorded.
Mm-hmm. And, I really appreciate that analysis. It cuts through so many of these, as I say, kind of contradictory messages that can leave you sort of spinning as you try to kind of figure out a means through the kind of questions of justice, which are so often in a carceral society, really determined in relationship to the justness of punishment. But in another instance, I mean, you've written an article on Keenan Anderson's death at the hands of the Los Angeles police. You write in that article in which, that's titled LAPD held down Keenan Anderson, repeatedly tased him, then suggested his death was his own fault, that body cam footage showed Keenan Anderson being chased and pinned down in the middle of the street. He was held down, tased for, a total of over 90 seconds. Just brutalized, taken to the hospital, dies 4 hours later. And so the thing that you said now so long ago, the first time you spoke to me, is that we need to actually move past requiring, as I think you put it, a supply of black and brown death in the coming from visual culture, coming from the media, toward a kind of more capacious historical frame, in a sense, like to make the connections clear. Like reflecting on this in relationship to your article on Keenan Anderson, I was thinking also about the documentary Riotsville, USA, created by Sierra Pettengill. Pettengill is offering this kind of theoretical analysis, in a sense, and there's like one line in particular from that documentary where she talks about wishing she had a photo that captured both the state's repression and the character of the kinds of rebellions and so-called riots that it causes. But like, that's not what we get from visual culture. We get snippets, we get, 15 seconds, we get an image, right?
Right.
And there's so much outside of that frame. And I think like this is part of what you were kind of pushing against. And yet clearly these images like matter, they're crucial, like making them public is always part of the push by often progressives to demand justice, to make these crimes visible. Without them, we have to rely on the police's accounts, which, as you point out, in this instance, in Keenan Anderson's instance, is deeply skewed by the sort of stigma around drug use. So I wondered if you could unpack that article and what you're talking about in terms of like the PR tactic of the LAPD, relying on racist narratives around drugs, and just thoughts on like the power of images in 2023.
It's a very complicated one in terms of talking about the consumption of these brutal, essentially like snuff films in a way.
Right.
But so just for some context for listeners, because I mean there have been all too many violent, like just extraordinary racist violent police murders in this year alone, and we're at the beginning of February.
Yeah.
But Keenan Anderson was held down, as you mentioned, and as I wrote in my recent column, and tased, and later died in hospital. And then clearly the causal relation to the tasing cannot be ignored, and I say, with even though there is no official autopsy report yet, I say unambiguously that man was killed by the police. Before any official independent autopsy has been released, the police then very quickly make a point of having a press conference to say, well, we did a quickie toxicology report on the guy, and he had traces of marijuana and cocaine in his system, which obviously opens up the right-wing charge of the man died from drugs, the racist charge of, well, he was on drugs, that's what killed him. Not only that gave the police grounds to like treat him as dangerous, but that clearly is why he died. Had he not been on drugs, he would have died. All we know from that toxicology report is that within like 3 days of his encounter with police, he had maybe the smallest trace of the only drug that could remotely be relevant here, cocaine. And also, to be clear, it can't be relevant almost without exception. When cocaine overdoses happen, it's when the person is taking cocaine. You don't get a cocaine overdose 4 hours after being in hospital, after having been tased again and again and beaten by cops. It's not the cocaine that's killing you. But of course, it played into these discrediting, victim-blaming narratives. Now to talk about the use of the use and abuse and dangers of circulation of these death images, usually from police body cams, sometimes from as we know, from George Floyd's execution, cell phone footage of people nearby, and other examples like that. And I had made this, I'm white and privileged, as my voice probably clarifies to anyone who knows anything about England. And I had certainly made the mistake before of seeing a sort of like justice in the circulation of these images, the sort of taking the image into victims' own hands, and they're choosing to share it, and then repeat aspects of the images in protest to reclaim it. So, hands up, don't shoot, for example, became a protest chant. But by the same token, like, let's talk about what's actually happening and what does and doesn't entail any sort of justice with this sort of circulation. Because even in the Tyre Nichols released video, there isn't something that's just necessarily like some transcending, indisputable truth that is spoken to power, that is then achieved by videos like this, and that then police are held accountable and discredited, because you even see the narratives play out in these videos. Cops who know how to narrativize during the filming in ways that can already discredit their victim, can already create some sort of notion of justified violence. And that's available because it pre-exists. There is no like pre-political truth to these videos. There is a standing, established narrative that the police and the power structures that they protect and support and represent, that it's even legible that an unarmed or even an armed black man or black child could be legible at all as a risk, per se, as always already a risk, such that the interaction in the first place could make any sense. 5 cops on one guy. So it's not like just the fact of a brutal murder caught on film in and of itself overcomes those entrenched narratives that courts continue to agree upon, that policing budgets to continue to agree upon, that black life needs to be policed and disposed of in this way. So the idea that just a video could overcome that, I think, misunderstands what, as you say, snippets, but any sort of like visual representation as some sort of pure and overwhelming fact could be. And I just think it's empirically untrue. Even if some, video evidence has led to some necessary but deeply insufficient carceral responses, for example, like George Floyd's killers being convicted. Hardly justice there. And we also have too many centuries of just kind of proven limitations of what it means to circulate these kind of images as this sort of path to justice. It just isn't. It's often, within the framework of the white gaze, just a reassertion of injustice. And it's not like there wasn't a market largely for almost entirely for white audiences of lynching photos were mass reproduced and sold. So clearly the like violent images of black people being executed in the most appalling ways in front of mobs, that being caught on film was in no way some sort of inherent means to justice. Quite the opposite. These were tokens for a racist white economy, a racist white market who want to consume and hold these
Mm-hmm.
images. Am I comfortable to say that things have moved on so much when these things circulate on Twitter and that there's just some sort of power to them per se that will lead to justice? I mean, it's simply untrue. I think something much more sticky and maybe much more disgusting is going on. And how many more times, how many more videos? If this was some sort of path to justice, this would have happened right now. This would have happened. So I just don't think these visual objects circulating do the work that sometimes we like to pretend they do, and they might be doing something much more damaging. Is that to say, end body cams, end filming cops? Absolutely not. It's about how these images get circulated and the assumption that there is some sort of attainment of justice in circulating these really violent images of Black Death again and again and again, when there just hasn't been for centuries.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's this notion that, like, of course, images are powerful, but they just aren't the whole story. All of the stuff that falls outside of the frame is really crucial, and I think like the way that you convey that insight in your piece on Keenan Anderson's death is really powerful. Like, especially the notion that propaganda is in some cases, like we overestimate its power in ways that are a little bit mystifying, right? Like that, as you say, like in the article, the lionization of the police is as deep seated as any American ideology. It's resistant to, even the appropriate canceling or repositioning of cops, for example, or live PD. These criminally propagandist shows. And so to again quote you, you say it would be too generous to those in power to grant that they have simply been misled by propaganda. What's clear is that the institution of policing, it runs deeper, like it's more entrenched. It's about the correlation you say between property, power, and racial hierarchy. So I wondered if you could expand on this idea that we maybe overestimate the impact of propaganda and miss the ideological expediency of just carceral thinking. I mean, despite the fact that, as you say, police killed over 1,100 people in 2022, more killings than in any of the last 10 years, you still have a bloating of police budgets across the board. So clearly, just removing cops or live PD from the air is not adequate. Clearly, body cams are not adequate. They themselves become a form of propaganda to the extent that police are being trained to, as you say, like narrate what's happening in real time. Like they're openly told during training, in fact, that
Right.
the function of body cameras is to exonerate police.
Yeah, and I think that's so, it's the same in terms of, when we're talking about like fictional, and I say this as someone who like I think I've seen every episode of Law and Order SVU, and that it's propaganda in the same way that 24 was like war on terror propaganda. So I
Mm-hmm.
don't think these things do nothing in society at all. Um but I would also say, like, what are the assumptions and presumptions already at play that mean these shows can be bought and sold to networks and signed off on in the first place? What is happening, as you say, that like frames the frame when police turn on their body cams? And I think if like the suggestion of we maybe overestimate the strength of fictional cop shows, or when cops put out videos of like look at this lovely neighborhood cop being hugged by a kid, or like kneeling alongside
Sure.
this peaceful Black Lives Matter protest. These new like cop cars that I think I that are like decorated in like Black Lives Matter decals and stuff like that. I mean, this isn't, they wouldn't bother with shit like that if it didn't have some
Hmm.
power. But I think if that's all that, as you say, if that's all the power it had, all our struggle would just have to be focusing on overwhelming that with counter propaganda, or stopping that propaganda, or ending SVU. But and again, like most abolitionists, like most of my friends who share my abolitionist politics, also will indulge in their little bit of Law and Order SVU, and it's like this fantasy of a different kind of policing, or just a like you know I also watch horror films and I don't want them to be real. But I
Hmm.
think, yeah, if these sort of visual representations, fictional and non-fictional, fictional, were the only thing we had to deal with, um, then that would be a much easier fight and a much easier struggle. But actually, we have to deal with why these things make sense in the first place, and that is, the hegemonic structure from which they are birthed, wherein, to use Gramsci's term of common sense, the standing common sense, not good sense, but the standing common sense is around the necessity of cops, is around property relations, and thus is around certain standing for whiteness. And that's a lot, shifting a hegemony is much harder than turning off certain visual stimuli, obviously, and shifting
Hmm.
popular narratives on TV, although it's all part of it. So I think, yeah, what are the conditions of possibility that those kind of shows make sense in the first place? And obviously, it's a deep, deep entrenched policing ideology and carceral ideology, an idea of what justice gets to look like, and what investigation means, and what, to the extent of what even like truth through justice systems gets to be. And it's much deeper than, you know, uh, sometimes the critiques even of propaganda appreciate.
Hmm. Yeah, well said. And I guess I wanted to ask you about the two articles in particular that you've written on the crackdown on Cop City protesters in Atlanta, and the kind of role of the kind of rewriting of the law that has been happening, especially after January 6th and the Capitol riots, and some of its sort of knock-on effects in terms of policing the left, suppressing movements against ecocide and against genocide. And this is to the point of like how does a radical movement gain and maintain momentum? Like one of the things you're saying here is that and it's in the title that the crackdown is brutal because of the movement's success. Like you're talking about the particular staying power of the movement against Cop City, its organizing tactics, its inventiveness. So there's a lot of this kind of underlining of the positive aspects of this, but this is now on people's radar in part because of the killing of Tortuguita, this 26-year-old ecological activist. And I guess I wanted to ask you, what you're trying to work through here in terms of the sort of insurgency from above that's happening in Atlanta, where now it appears as though Cop City's development is like moving forward, despite the fact that there is an oppositional movement and occupation that says we're not going away. And in particular, like the role of the invocation of domestic terror laws to suppress this ongoing occupation of the planned Cop City. I mean, that, of course, also, and for people that don't know, if you could explain like what Cop City represents, this massive investment.
Right, absolutely. So yeah, like a few things there. So first of all, just to
Mm-hmm.
touch on the first point, about abolitionists articulating the difficulty of that articulation, and like, there are people who do it
Mm-hmm.
much better than I do, like people like Mariam Kaba, Derica Purnell, I think, are like really crucial leading thinkers in this moment. And Yeah, obviously a huge part, this moment in 2020, uh during, Black proletarian led uprisings, seemed to like crack open the possibility of a discourse around abolition being taken more seriously, sometimes in the more defanged language of defund, which then itself was considered just unspeakable because of the prioritization of election narratives. So it was obviously, yes, it was a really violent betrayal. And I'm not denying that maybe defund was not a particularly successful like electoral strategy. I don't think those in the streets were really thinking about electoral strategy at that point, and nor should they be. But I would say that yes, I think the and this is not the first time it's happened, the deep betrayal of even allegedly like progressive Democrats following 2020 just I think underlines the difficulty of this struggle, and the assumption of that covenant between people and police, um like against all evidence, right? Like, this is when liberal calls for being rational and reasonable show their own ill reason, and that they can't even live up to their own standards, because we've got multiple reports and findings that police, they don't stop crime, they don't prevent crime, that the carceral state produces more violence than it um would potentially stop, the racism of it all, the murderousness of it all. This has been well established, so to the point that were we living in any sort of rational political body politic, it would be the defenders of carceral policing and policing per se that would have to answer, that would have to, the burden would be on them to defend the police, rather than the burden being on abolitionists to say what exactly we would do instead. But that's not what happens, which speaks to how, this is a matter of deep foundational ideology in this country. So, that's what's going on there, and it's very, very hard to overcome, especially when alleged allies are so willing to drop it. And then, okay, to move on to Cop City, which is a planned Riotsville of sorts, a planned hugest in the state and its surrounding states, planned to be cop training area. There's supposed to be an entire mock downtown built where cops can practice their riot suppression, including with, like fake rioting actors, and, practice using missile launchers and training with explosives. And cops from all around the country are supposed to be able to go there and train too. So really, and the plan for this, it's not just they're using, what would have already been, a mass tract of concrete. The movement against it is called Defend the Atlanta Forest / Stop Cop City, because the plan for Cop City is to raise, well over 100 acres of Atlanta's forest lands. Atlanta, for people who don't know about its terrain a lot, because I mean, often when you just see televised and news depictions of Atlanta, you just see like, inner city sort of stuff. But it's got a huge forest. It's got one of the biggest forest canopies and forest coverage areas of any city in the United States, and forest that protects from flooding, that obviously keeps the air cleaner, and the forest particularly that Cop City aims to raise is surrounded by a vastly predominantly poor black neighborhoods, who would be directly at risk from the noise pollution, air pollution, and just the presence of the violent fact of more cops training in their vicinity. So Stop Cop City is both a challenge to the continued funding of aggressively militarized policing in the US. It is an environmental struggle to protect a forest that is necessary for the people of Atlanta. that was also previously, these unbroken histories used to be a prison farm. So this is a continued um, struggle against, like white supremacist policing, um, which meets itself at the intersection of environmental racism. So for the last well over a year, organizers against Cop City have, as I noted in my piece, and I've in a couple of pieces, they've been incredibly successful. Like, ground has not yet been broken, and they've been successful as a small movement by being really nimble and using numerous tactics and strategies, including engaging with, local community kids who've done, like, peaceful marches. Then also creating an encampment in the forest itself, where people have, like, fed each other and looked after each other with waxing and waning numbers, but there's always been a sort of base of it, including a more militant contingent who've been willing to, create tree sits, which are risky, and take up the front lines when police have attempted incursions. And there's also been more of a national effort to make very specific targets, both for protest and for low level property damage, of the mass corporations, from real estate to even like Coca-Cola, that are pouring money into the Cop City project. And some of that has been incredibly successful, not just because, this occupation has lasted so long. I mean, most don't, right? Like, Occupy Wall Street in New York was 3 months in actually keeping the park. Um, Standing Rock was far shorter, even though it was much, much, much larger. But they've just had incredible staying power and incredible ability to use different kinds of tactics and bring in different coalitions. Was it scalable? Is it scalable? I mean, that's always a question, but I think it shouldn't, even if the answer to that is no, it shouldn't not mean that it's not something to learn from, as the forest defenders themselves have explicitly and quite obviously learnt from preceding movements. Yes, in the last last 6 weeks, police have escalated their attacks against the forest defenders, including a highly militarized raid, multi-agency raid, in which one forest defender, Tortuguita, was killed under very, very questionable circumstances. Of course, or unquestionable, if you ask me. The police have claimed that
Sure.
he was shot first. Even if that's the case, their family, excuse me, last week, or even this week, released a statement based on the autopsy that they had demanded, which revealed that they had at least 12 bullets in their body. So, was that
Wow.
that was necessary to, even if it was to disarm. Although released today body cam footage from the police, even though there was no direct body cam footage, but from body cam wearing agencies that were nearby the shooting and heard it, one officer can be heard saying, oh, something along the lines of, oh, those like assholes shot one of their own, because only one officer who is wounded, not dead, was hit with a bullet. So, there has since been, rightfully so, a national outpouring, a number of vigils, a number of acts of solidarity, further property damage against the supporters of Cop City, and in turn, an aggressive raid to try and clear the encampments. Will Cop City go ahead feasibly? The Dakota Access Pipeline, Trump eventually gave that permission to go ahead. Standing Rock was cleared, but did it nonetheless set an example and an incredible inspiration of, intersectional struggle, Indigenous-led climate struggle, that very much kept at its heart an understanding that such struggle can't just be about one pipeline, can't just be about land in a kind of non-robust sense. It has to be about abolitionism and community building and liberation, essentially. These are liberation struggles. I think looking to Atlanta, because of all the issues it brings together, and the way it's been able to really articulate that is it's been really inspiring. And I think, it is of course a shame that yes, it wasn't until yet another police murder, in fact the first, even though environmentalists are around the world uh, killed by military and police forces in the hundreds, if not thousands, every year. This is the first example of
Yeah.
an environmentalist killed in the US. And then to the question of terrorism. So at the same time as losing a beloved comrade, the Atlanta Forest Defenders have had to reckon with incredibly extreme charges for their presence at various protest actions and their presence in the forest, with over 20 people currently facing state terror charges, because there is a state terror statute in Atlanta. Um, and I think that is a reminder, which is not a surprising one to a lot of leftists, myself included, that we should be really cautious about pushing, I mean, using the word terrorism, but also pushing for further state engagement with the term and further terror statutes in terms of taking on the far right. So after January 6th, the Biden administration, did use the word domestic terrorism, talked about expanding federal domestic terror statutes, because right now there aren't exactly federal anti-terrorism laws, but DHS, Department of Homeland Security, has categorizations of what counts as domestic terror in order to investigate and build cases around certain groups. And it's, wildly distorted. Yes, I'm not saying that there haven't been major cases against white supremacist organizations. There have been, but given that well over 70% of extremist killings in the last 30 years, and even more so in percentage wise, have been right wing extremists and white supremacists. The focus on looking and creating categories like Black identity extremist, as happened under Trump, are sort of laughable. And what that shows, which is no surprise to those rightly skeptical of this kind of state effort, is that terror is always a title used by the state to select its own enemies, and we shouldn't be surprised that that is then weaponized more readily and historically against Black liberationists, anti-capitalists, environmentalists, those who genuinely threaten the status quo of the state, rather than the sort of white supremacists with deep entrenchment and connections to and presence in law enforcement apparatus. A lot of the rare focus when these sort of categories have been robustly and forcefully applied to white supremacists are, examples like Waco, where there are anti-state, libertarian extremists, or, the Bundy Ranch, things like that. But on the whole, no, like the sort of white supremacist thin blue line sort of extremist activity rarely invites the category terrorist being applied to it. And that's why, I think the understanding, the framework of the anti-fascist framework of this being a three-way fight, that there is no allegiance to find with the state in these matters, even in the rare occasions, for example, after January 6th, where the state did apply its resources to crack down on far-right extremism.
An enormous amount that I'd want to speak to. But the thing that I guess I want to follow up on that with is, my reading of your sense of the danger of tired tropes. There are these tired tropes in political thinking, political discourse, in political realism broadly, that are real profound barriers. So in the case of Cop City, the money is there for this project, let's call it. The plan is in place. Economic interests in the city are in support. Same with city council. and a small group stands against it. And one of the things that stands against that small group is a certain kind of tired trope of what you call the kind of green scare, this fear of environmental and animal rights activists destabilizing the system fundamentally, like questioning private property, questioning capitalism, questioning extractivism. So there are all of these tired tropes that you're talking about. For example, in your article on why queer communities are welcoming armed anti-fascist protection, one of the tired tropes you talk about is this kind of both sidesism of, violence necessarily begetting more violence, that political counter-violence is always bad because it's going to create some sort of a spiral of violence. You talk about, Biden's border policies and this tired trope of cruelty is the point, right? Which is, again, this kind of thing that really mystifies what's actually happening, which is the reproduction of a logic of disposability and a nativism that, or race realism that is deadly, right?
Right.
So in terms of, this tired trope analysis that runs through a lot of your work, I wonder if you could kind of help us theorize it in terms of like, from my perspective, the question of like political exhaustion, like the trap of having to use a political, like legible nomenclature that just gets worn down over time. Like, how do you think about tired tropes? How can the strategy of exhaustion be combated? And do you kind of consciously try to write with an awareness of the need to kind of evolve your own concepts and deconstruct them?
Gosh, it's tricky. Because, like obviously, those in liberation struggle shouldn't, in my view, spend a lot of energy trying to like fight processes of co-optation. I mean, obviously be like acutely aware of them because it can, very much destabilize and defang a movement. But, if we spent all our time being like, oh, so the CIA put out like a woke advert being like, this woman of color is a CIA agent and she's doing it as like a Black Latina feminist in the words of this advert that is a real thing. And you know, does the fact of co-optation doesn't therefore mean like the CIA gets to own Black feminism? Like they just don't. And so just like with something like
Sure.
that, I'm just like, let's keep going then. And any sort of Glenn Greenwaldy, Tucker Carlson-y types who are like, see, wokeness is just actually a way to support the CIA. Like, no, feminist liberation struggle is not a way to support the CIA. The fact of co-optation does not mean that the thing being co-opted was in fact powerful and to be maintained and fought for. In fact, it probably means the opposite. Like if state powers see something as potentially crucial and powerful, it's maybe because it is indeed that, and it shouldn't be ceded. That shouldn't be ceded to them. In terms of the tiredest of all, perhaps, of like violence begets violence, take the high road, we go high, they go low. I mean, what's sort of fascinating about the violence begets violence, particularly in this country's history, is that it's we just don't really, in terms of liberation struggle, there just really isn't evidence of defensive violence. Overwhelming, it doesn't always achieve a stated purpose, but the idea that it therefore like exceeds a stated purpose and then creates this creates or perpetuates this cycle of violence is simply not true. Like even in terms of slave revolts and the protection of marronage communities, of course there was defensive violence, but actually very little. Like there was very little retributive violence against slaveholders and those who attempted to break apart marronage communities. In the same way, if you think about what was deemed, the extraordinary violence of the Black Power movement, it was actually, there was actually very little retributive killings. And, depends what you think property damages, but I certainly wouldn't say. I think there are examples of. I think it can be really tempting to be like property damage is never violence, windows can't scream. I'm like, well, I don't know, the desecration of a synagogue by a Nazi to me is violent. So I don't want to say that there's no such thing as violent property damage. I don't think property damage against, brutal power structures, corporate power structures, policing power structures, constitutes violence, which speaks to the fact that obviously what gets to be violence has to be contextualized, and we're dealing with a problem where the state and capital seems to have a monopoly on that sort of delineation and distinction drawing. That's a problem. Another thing to struggle against, a key thing. But what I think groups are doing successfully, for example, the anti-fascist gun clubs, who are willing to take those front lines and stand in front of drag queen story hours and family friendly drag brunches, or not so family friendly and kinky drag brunches. Not that who gets to be a family, but is that like liberal decrials of it, it's not stopping them doing it, right? Like they're still going to continue that work, and that I think is just that's all that can be done. Do I think my job as a writer, often with a view to picking apart liberal pieties? Like, no, I'm not. I don't. Obviously, opinion writing is part of that, is an effort towards persuasion, but I'm not trying to persuade any members of the far right. It's not, and they're not reading the Intercept anyway, and it's just not what I'm aiming for. Do I often have in my imagined sights well-meaning liberals who think themselves progressivist, who aren't knowingly committed to sort of neoliberal statecraft, but find themselves regurgitating and repeating these kind of tropes, these tired tropes, without really, they repeat them as sort of certainties. They're sort of learnt practices, they're habits. It's a set of habit forming. These aren't something that they've like sat down and learned. You can learn something like, this, like this is the speed a fly flies. These are things you can like investigate and look into. You can learn which trains run from the Nevins Street stop in New York. Those are things that if you don't know, you go and learn them. You don't just imbibe them like you do these tired political tropes, like you do white ideology, like you do all kinds of societal habit forming practices that people just sort of take up and take as common sense. This is, what Gramsci did mean by common sense, some of which has the seeds of revolutionary thought in need of articulation. Some of it is deeply traditional. But these aren't things that people hold dearly to because they have sat around and like done the research. So I think like the use in calling that to people's attention, actually picking those tropes apart, is it always successful? No, people have a lot of, I don't know, commitments and convictions and comforts and desire for a comfort in maintaining tropes against violence and anger, and what is productive or not. I was actually reading a paper yesterday by the British philosopher Amir Shrivinasan, who mainly works in analytic philosophy. It's not like, not, she has some radical propositions. She wrote a book called The Right to Sex, which was a feminist book, and she's cool. But she wrote a paper a while back that I was reading randomly yesterday about how we talk about anger, and she starts it by recalling the debate between William F. Buckley and James Baldwin at the Cambridge University Union, that it was recorded and people still watch it a lot. It's like pretty famous because it was like, James Baldwin versus conservative William F. Buckley, and Buckley sort of presents himself as sympathetic to black struggle. He says, like, I agree that the society is very racist and there's a lot of oppression. But he says, I think that anger from those in the struggle is counterproductive. And therefore you should stop. with this expression of anger, with this anger. And Baldwin rejects that for good reason, and explains that the line is along the lines of, not that I would deign to quote without having in front of me, but so paraphrase is that the state of being a black man in America is a state of rage, and having to manage that, and that in itself is a sort of second order injustice. Not only the state of affairs that means that rage occurs and is apt, but then also having to reckon with the second order injustice of then being told that you have to decide whether your very reasonable rage is okay because it might be counterproductive. Whereas if you think about like a personal circumstance where you have a friend who's been harmed by someone, say they're really angry because their partner betrayed them or cheated on them, you don't say, don't be angry, it's counterproductive. You ask, oh, why are you angry? And they give you the reasons for their anger, and you say, oh, that's very justifiable anger. I'm not going to tell you to stop being angry. That would be absurd. Whereas somehow in these moments of struggle, it seems like there's people help themselves, those in power, liberal mainstream, help themselves to a logic that doesn't actually justify itself, which is, your anger is not justified if it's counterproductive. Stop being angry, it's counterproductive. Stop expressing anger, which is being angry. There's no such thing as, like, anger is expressed, right? Like, yes, there are examples of suppression of it, but we understand the meaning of the word anger through its behavioral expression. So being asked to stop being angry because it's not productive is saying, oh, I, the mainstream observer, have decided that it's more important to be productive than it is to be apt, than it is to be correct, to have. And that, some people might say, I believe in that, and here's why, but they have to give grounds for believing in that. We can't take it as a given that is right, and it is taken as a given. And I think calling that, I was like, oh, I like that, and I hadn't even thought of it in those terms, and I bring it up now just because I read Amir's paper yesterday. But I think it's like, it's worth all of us thinking about, for ourselves, for those we communicate with, for those we are engaged in protest and movements with, of, it is a moral decision to say, to only talk about whether something's productive or counterproductive instead of whether it's justified or apt or has good grounds, and that you have to choose between those things. Maybe you do have to choose between those things at certain moments, but that choice is a moral one that shouldn't just be assumed that we know the answer. And I think that's a lot of what's going on when people talk about, like, the counterproductivity of angry responses, aggressive protest tactics, and they haven't actually fully given grounds or enough of a strong argument to say that actually their claims of counterproductivity are correct, for one, but also that they're more moral.
I mean, there's a ton there, and I wanted to kind of use it to raise the question of Chantal Mouffe's recent writing on left populism. What Mouffe is sort of trying to think through is this, and again, it runs parallel with your refusal of this kind of liberal model of civility and patience, a commitment to reason that is a kind of Janus-faced commitment to reason, given the ways in which it disregards the data calculatedly in certain ways around the viability of the defund movement, for example, and a commitment to direct action and even aggressive resistance, like as something that could actually get us out of the sort of place of being mired in a pseudo-centrism. For Mouffe, like, there is this resurgent nationalism of far-right populism that needs to be countered. And from her perspective, it really does come down to, like, what we do with our anger, like how we translate it into something meaningful. And that's a problem on the left. To use your term, we've kind of kneecapped ourselves to a certain extent. And I guess, like, the kind of case study that I think it makes sense to focus on is the wave of anti-trans legislation in the United States, and not just in the United States, but how you're writing about it in terms of, like in your article on Michigan's new anti-trans bill, which is so punitive, you say that, part of this is about mainstreaming, right? You say that anti-trans liberal feminism has been mainstreamed in the very same opinion pages that once treated the position as an unpleasant British curiosity, right? So there's like a kind of civil centrist complicity with far right populist panics and even fascism, you say, that reinforces transphobia. Here, you need sharpness. You need a clearer politics of trans liberation, and yet we're not seeing it, right? Like, so I don't know if you could speak to this sort of liberal allergy to clarity around like the particular question of gender affirming care and yeah, like where that comes from.
Yeah, and I mean, I wouldn't. Yeah, and I'm not sure like the left has kneecapped itself. I mean, like there are many ways in which it has, right? But like
Uh-huh.
those are, there's lots of
Mm.
different like lefts, I guess. I would say liberals have kneecapped the left. But also, yeah, I mean, I'm also nervous to like use. I don't know how like, and I don't really have much space to go into it now. I don't know how much I believe in the idea of like a left populism, and I would also say a lot of
Mm.
people that do take up the uh, at least the kind of term of left populism are exactly often the kind of leftists who have no interest in trans liberation and call it a distraction. So I think that to me is deeply dangerous.
Uh-huh.
But in terms of like the
Yeah.
liberal mainstreaming of anti-transness, um, I mean, it speaks to like something that it's incredibly troubling and like actually not something I particularly expected because I mean, yes, you can
Mm-hmm.
expect all kinds of uh, rabid defenses of uh, gender binaries and protection of like the traditional family from all um, political backgrounds. So, of course, like conservative liberals, it doesn't particularly surprise me that they would find themselves aligning with the right. And it was unusual that for a few years there was this massive transphobia sullying every single newspaper in England, including The Guardian, and continues to do so. It's vile, in the name of feminism. So trans exclusionary feminism. Um, and at the time, and there was a New York Times column written a few years ago by my friend Sophie Lewis, saying like why like explaining to Americans why British liberals there was so much turfism in British liberalism, and that article made sense at the time because you didn't see it so much in the mainstream press here. Being transphobic was, just a few years ago, very much a mark of the far right. It was like you're wearing a MAGA hat, you love austerity. I mean, liberals love austerity too, but you love Trump and you hate trans people. And it had been obviously a major platform at the state level for Republican representatives. But then there's this sort of sea change wherein every week now there's similar things that you would have seen in The Guardian from writers like Pamela Paul in the New York Times. And then reported pieces that include a lot of trans voices and make statements about like the importance of trans healthcare for youth and stuff, but hang this in their two sidesism, very much leave the reader, especially the not particularly informed reader, with the sense of trans children as a site of peril. And that we're dealing with some sort
Mm-hmm.
of social contagion that could be a site of peril, when no other medical interventions, including teenage girls getting cosmetic breast surgery, which is, happens to just infinitesimally more often than trans top surgeries for trans youth. I think these are really problematic news reports, and trans children would not be notional as a site of peril if society as a whole wanted trans children, right? Like, and I think that's what this points to. Is like some, in a deep sense, even very like, oh, of course, I like, I the people who are like, I have friends who are trans, or I respect anyone's choice to be trans, actually with these sort of articles and this sort of suspicion, you very much see an underlying, and I think in need of reckoning with, point that like suggests that like it's not just about tolerating trans children that we need. It's like wanting trans children. I'm not saying wanting cis children who are not trans to be trans, but saying like, oh, trans children is like, that's great. And the historian Jules Gill Peterson makes that point, and it shows how far away we are from that. And it's a very kind of, you know, the liberal tendency towards tolerance being the highest political notion, or the highest political stance we could have towards difference, as opposed to an embracing and a flourishing. And I think, you know, it's really notable to me that the same sort of rhetoric, the same sort of even like sentence structures we did see, you know, as only like a decade or so ago, and then just some decades before that ago, of calling into being this like figurative child who's under threat, which is, you know, the constancy that is central to fascist rhetoric, like the future, the child, this child figuration who is never a real child. But you see liberals doing that again too, and they'll say things like, you know, of course, if a child is trans and they want to be a trans, I respect that, but I'm just worried. I'm worried their lives will be difficult. I'm worried they'll suffer. But that's exactly what people said in almost the same, you know, syntax, saying, oh, you know, if people are gay, fantastic, but should they be able to adopt children? I just worry about the children. And people before that used to say that about interracial marriage. You know, people can love who they want, but I do worry about the children and the suffering of interracial children. And of course, the answer then and the answer now is, there is a way to relieve that suffering, and that is to change the societal context such that trans children are not considered a site of peril, but that they are embraced. And that all kinds of gender variation is embraced, and the ability to move back and forth, right? And I think it's that sort of, you know, I don't think we can shift the minds of the absurd far right who will use this, you know, their pronatalism, body fascism, removal of all bodily autonomy. This is very much it's central to their program. This is not, you know, there's no persuading there, you know, as it was in Mussolini's program. But I think for liberals, well-meaning liberals, I think calling to attention how much they have landed on the side of the far right through sentences like this, through upholding this sort of fascist figuration of a child rather than embracing real children, I think is really important. And I think, and also remembering that, you know, a lot of this struggle and discussion is around bans, awful bans that must be stopped on access to healthcare for trans children. Most trans children have no resources or support to get anything like healthcare intervention and hormones in the first place. So it's even like, you know, the idea that this is readily available, let alone in order to be mass banned, it's barely available in the first place. So I think we have to keep that in mind too, and not be kind of led astray by either far right rhetoric, of course, but even the current New York Times rhetoric.
Yeah, I mean, because, you know, obviously, especially when you're talking about an audience that might not have the information, rhetoric has this kind of reifying effect. And so, yeah, like trying to simply push against and say like trans is not the worst case scenario, and try to unpack these underlying assumptions is really powerful. I mean, using language carefully can either, you know, doing so hopefully will engender a degree of sympathy, or if more than sympathy, like,
or shared struggle, you know,
a shared struggle. And this is what I appreciate about your writing and the way you communicate, right? Like, the goal clearly for you is to kind of write urgently for the purpose of creating timely effects. So I really appreciate you making the time to talk to me.
Well, thank you very much. It was excellent to talk to you, and thank you for your kind words.